Okay. Jane, can you, if you said the sign-in link's broken, can you look at that?
I don't know anything about that, dude. What's the sign-in link? That one right there?
Yeah.
Testing.
Works?
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Is that, why can't I type?
Mic check. Mic check. Testing, testing.
Why isn't my keyboard not typing?
Mic check. Mic check.
Are any of your buttons working?
No, my keyboard isn't working. It's acting weird. It's acting like one giant key. Okay, now it's working. It's kind of working.
So that's actually
Mic check.
trying to see that.
It's just not acceptable. Like the Google Form is there.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Good. Hello, testing, 1, 2, 3. How are we doing, everyone? Really? How are we doing? Good. Thank you. Perfect. All right. Well, welcome to the ACM meeting. Really excited to have everybody here today. Before we get started, just a few quick announcements. ACM shirts, if you haven't picked it up already, what's going on, just come pick it up. Talk to us. We have them in the TA room. Come by whenever. Other ACM events. So we have our Rowdy Creators meeting that's coming up this Friday. That's from 2 to 4 in MPP 4.140. That's the activity room. Who knows what Rowdy Creators is? Some people? Few people? Okay. So Rowdy Creators is essentially an organization that's like within the umbrella of ACM. And what we're doing is putting together projects on our own. So instead of doing something that's on the academic track, we're deciding on different project topics and going with that. So if you're interested in joining that, I would definitely encourage you to at least go to a meeting, check it out. And if you find something that you're really interested in, you can definitely jump on that project. We have our ACM Social on Friday as well. That's from 6 to 8 in Harris, HSU 2.212. And that's our Super Smash Bros. Tournament. We did have an issue with the registration. So if you tried to register and it said that you already registered, but you didn't really, go back and check out that link again. It's posted in our Slack in the announcements channel, and we hope to see everyone there. Our general meeting next week, we're excited about. It's going to be with Booz Allen Hamilton. They're doing DIY web dev with Django and React. So it's going to be a little bit kind of like a workshop, but mostly a tech talk to kind of get you introduced to creating a personal like web-based service. So if you're interested in that at all, come next Wednesday, 12 to 1, same time, same location here in Ratana. And ACMW has a meeting following that at 2 p.m. in Willow, and that's a Grace Hopper social. So if you went to Grace Hopper, or if you're interested in that at all, definitely check it out. And without further ado, we'll have iHeartMedia come up and talk about some API principles. Let's give them a hand.
Great. Well, thanks for having us today. Sorry about the technical fun. It wouldn't be a presentation or a chat without that. That's sort of to raise the stress level of the speaker. Okay, so slightly different title, Web APIs and API Management. I'll introduce myself real quick and my two colleagues.
I'll work that presentation.
Okay, so my name's Arthur Wright. I'm a senior enterprise architect at iHeartMedia. One of the areas that I've been working on has been specifically in this area at iHeart. And then I've got Mark Bennett. He's is he senior VP? Yeah.
So I oversee infrastructure ops, city cloud operations, infrastructure, global cloud.
Okay. And I have my colleague Eldon Diovich down here. Okay, so there's a lot of talk about APIs. You know, there's a lot of hype about it. It's been on the hype curve for quite a while, for those of you who have heard about Gartner and the famous hype curve. So what I'd like to do today is just sort of like go through some of the aspects of API management and then how it gets implemented, what things you have to kind of look out for. And at the end, if we get that far, I can show you a couple of examples of how you'd specify web APIs in particular. All right, so the first thing to you know, what's an API? So, before we get any further, if you have questions, please just jump in and interrupt right away, and then we can just go ahead and have a more conversational.
Maybe raise a hand. Who's familiar with APIs? Who's done APIs before, written them?
Okay.
Who's written for an enterprise?
Okay. 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 So I think we'll have some eye openers here. All right. So when we talk about APIs, we're talking about fundamentally about application programming interfaces. The thing is, though, they've been around for quite a long time. We're way back, you know, in the 70s, I believe it was, when we start talking about cohesion and encapsulation and so on. So when people talk about APIs in 2019, they're talking primarily about web application APIs. Okay, so how I interconnect complex distributed architectures, applications between companies internally together. Okay, so it's really about how do I talk to my peer, right? What's the protocol for doing that? And then that over HTTP. All right, so we're limiting to a specific protocol, underlying protocol, HTTP, and we're saying this is what I'm going to send you, and this is how I expect you to respond. Very straightforward. Okay. Consumers shouldn't care about how the API is implemented, right? So I might have my Java application talking to a Node.js server, or it could be Python, it could be server application. It should not matter what the underlying implementation is if you're doing this right. And that's a key aha, because very often when we get further, I'll talk about some of the other technologies in this space. You'll see where that comes into play. Okay, could you flip to the next one? All right, so why is everybody talking about APIs? So the big reason for that, there's this whole sort of economy that's growing up around APIs, and this is literally, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? This is big stuff. This is Facebook, this is Google, this is storefront, this is, you know, YouTube, you name it. Everybody's got web APIs. So why are they doing this? Because they're not doing it for free. They're not doing this just to, you know, make everybody happy and give developers access to their platforms. They're doing it for the dollars, right? And the question is how are they making their money at the end of the day? Okay, so there's a couple of ways to do that. The first is the most direct way. You use my API, and I'll charge you. So by transaction, right? Or it could be by subscription. You pay me X dollars a month, and I'll let you use my APIs. Okay, most direct. But there's a lot of indirect ways too. So for example, in a business-to-business context, it maybe makes it cheaper for me to get all my invoicing done externally if I can have a neat API that I can use to just pass information back and forth. Get rid of all these faxes, get rid of the emails, etc. Right? So that's a more sort of business-to-business business context. It could be internally. So it's a big facilitator when you're in an environment where you've got a lot of legacy and you need to start figuring out how to get rid of some of that legacy and modernize, right? So what you typically will do is it's just like you would have in the SOA context. You'll encapsulate bits and pieces of your application landscape behind APIs, and then you will use that API to replace the underlying implementation with something more modern without disrupting the rest of your, right?
Yeah, so I was going to hint on, think of one thing that you use every day. How many of you use TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, name the service, everyone, right? Well, if you do your API infrastructure right, then how you get ads and where you get ads, you don't care. Because you're just going to subscribe to an ad server, and if they have an open API that you can get to relatively easy, you can change your architecture quickly and services that you're using or consuming for monetizing, right? And so what tends to happen is a lot of developers and software engineers want to build something really big. And actually you want to go small.
Right.
The smaller you are, if you're one of the microservices, kind of topology, and you're thinking that way, the more you can decouple your APIs, the better. And so think about that in your construct when you're building something. If you can't switch that out, or your API can't be easily called, then there's no money behind it. And we're not software engineers because we just want to create. Maybe it's easy. When you become software engineers and IT people, part of our goal is to capitalize on software.
So in that context, you should have picked up on a really key point there that Mark just mentioned. If you are you're doing a startup, right, and you want other companies or consumers or other developers to piggyback off what you're doing, or you want to find a way to monetize what you're doing, you need to pay attention to your APIs. Okay, we see this time and time again. Small companies, they go out there, they slap up something, throw an API out the window, and then people start using it, and then the fun and games start. You have to talk to a developer, otherwise you can't get this thing working, etc. Right? So part of being successful in this API economy is making it easier for developers to use your APIs. Okay. And that takes a bit of work. It takes a slightly different mindset from, okay, I'm just going to do this and then give them some key value pairs or whatever. Okay. In particular, documentation becomes important. The ability to, sort of mock and test the API, experiment with it in a safe environment becomes important. And then, of course, for you as the person offering or publishing that API, you need to be able to manage and control who's using your API for what purposes, right? Because there are people out there that are going to try to hack it. For example, when I was looking at an API management product last year, I put up a very, very basic proxy over Oxford dictionaries just to test out the proxying features. And I kid you not, it took all of 2 seconds to get hits from North Korea, Egypt, and India. Okay, and I hadn't even published this thing. So if you're not paying attention to security, it's going to hit you. All right, so the last point down here was digitalization. So this is lifting and shifting into the internet. So let's say you're a company, you've got some legacy that's sitting in your data center, and you want to actually lift everything into the cloud. Well, one of your enablers is going to be a well-defined set of APIs, right? So you can leave some things in legacy behind your API, move it into the cloud, build your new implementation in the cloud, and then point everything to that. Okay? So we can move off this, I think. Is there any questions about the API economy and what's driving that? How that works? Okay. Boring stuff. So what I wanted to talk about on this slide here is this middle piece here. So it's API management. So your APIs are sitting right there. So that's your Googles and so on. But they're actually slapping stuff on top of that API to expose it and offer it out to you. So this is the bit that's going to do all your security. Actually, you can just go into the next slide. There you go. It's going to do all your security. It's going to do your rate limiting, throttling, developer login. You'll have, so if I start over here, how do I access my API? So typically, you're going to be offered a subscription You'll have an application ID or a client ID, they'll call it in the jargon, that will be used with potentially passwords or keys so that you can call the API in the first place. And that's actually what's used to track your usage. It might be also what's used to decide when to start throttling you and doing rate limiting on you, depending on what you've paid, right? How do I get my dollars out? It'll be used to collect metrics. So a good API management solution is going to let you go, okay, well, how much traffic is this business doing with me versus that one, right? So that then obviously offers up sales opportunities. I can go back to them and go, hey, I'll give you an extra 100 requests per minute for this price, right? If you will do blah, 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 right? Okay.
I just want to hit on API versioning because that's going to be critical. Because the software engineers, it's a velocity game. You're out to create code fast, quickly, in the marketplace, Uber, Facebook, Google. It's time to market. And the longer it takes you to get product out the door, the less likely your product's going to be adopted. And one of the things we see quite a bit is API versioning, where we get into this world of sprawl. In software, you've seen it probably at our place. Every company has this, where I need API to get this data. Instead of getting really good, strong API inventory or versioning, we start creating multiple APIs that do the same thing. And thus, we just caused refactoring. That couldn't happen. If we could have organized our work in a meaningful way and had lifecycle management on our APIs. And you've got to think out through that. Because if you're always needing something and your answer is, I'm going to go create a new API, you've lost time. The API work should be one time reused as much as possible. So when you're thinking of your API, always think of scale, not as a one and done. One and done is a bad outcome. Because now, if I had an ad serving API that I could call, that someone could call, I'm done. I put my focus around that management. If I had an order management, if I had an inventory API, the more you can decouple that, and reuse that API, put governance on it, the more successful you're going to be. If not, you'll be putting a lot of APIs and trying to figure out which one has the right information you need instead of building a catalog for each one.
So on the versioning point, a couple of questions. So how many of you have actually built user interfaces that are using some kind of API? Okay, so of those, was that API versioned or not? In one case. So everybody else not, right? So what happens when you change that API? So let's say you add or you remove or you rename an attribute, right? If you're thinking about what that means for you, if you're developing a web application, especially a spa, and you've got a fairly broad API behind that, and now you have to go in and start changing all the URL to your endpoints because the version changed, and that you need to pay attention to this. And there's ways to do this well, and there's ways that aren't so good. And unfortunately, what you'll find is as you look in the industry, one of the most common ways is one of the most painful ways. Okay, all right, so let's talk a little bit about developer support. So that's my favorite, right? So this is the whole idea of having, especially if you're a larger enterprise and you're doing business and you're monetizing your APIs, having a catalog where people can find your APIs, right? So when you want to use Google's services, they've got a massive catalog, and you can go in there and by API, you can check and see what's available. You get documentation on it, how to use it, and in some cases you have the ability to directly test it. You've got test code examples and so on. Okay. The second part of it ties in closely with that is obviously the documentation piece itself. Am I having somebody sit down and write all that code in Markdown or something, or can I generate some of that documentation, right? Do I offer developers a way to test the API out and play around just so that they can wrap their heads around what they're doing, right? So that's a big piece of API management, right? There's obviously other things in there. I kind of glossed over probably what people would say was the most important one, which is security, right? So your ability to obviously authenticate and authorize users, but it's also threat countermeasures, you know, whitelisting or blacklisting IP addresses, looking for patterns of usage that maybe aren't in line with what you're expecting or what you think is okay, right? There may also be certificates involved for different stakeholders, right? So
The content caching is really important too. Because if you're making requests over and over and over, you don't have that content caching, CDN or something sitting in front of it potentially, depending on the type of request or object you're calling, you could just drain your whole system and not realize it. And the last thing you want is APIs that can't handle scale, right? So all these things, does any of this in here surprise anybody, or is it, when you're building API, do you think this way, across the board, or do you think, hey, I got to get code out the door, my part's done, next, you know, operations, SREs, or some group will take care of all this other stuff? But
I've clicked on it and it's good to go.
it's good to go. But really, when you think of software engineering, security should come to the front. If you think security is on the back end after you release something, then you've missed an opportunity to put the trusted software out the door. And so when you're thinking of security, also come to the front. When I'm deploying something through the pipeline, it should be secure from the get-go. If it's not secure from the get-go, then you're going to be reactive the entire time, and you'll be fighting threat actors trying to defend at the perimeter. And you could have done the right things up front with secure software.
So that's API management. By the way, so what a lot of companies do, especially smaller companies where you don't have either the investment in an API management solution, because these are products. There's a product category for this. Things like Apogee out there. WSO2 has product. MuleSoft has product in this space, right? So they're actually specifically API management solutions with a secure gateway and developer portals and the whole 9 yards, right? So, but in smaller companies, you maybe don't have that. So typically what happens in those environments is you slap up hopefully a reverse proxy or a secure gateway, and then you put your APIs behind that, and then you give your customer or clients a PDF somewhere and say, this is how you use this API, right? But you can see how that's not going to scale very well. All right. So some principles. So you've got two choices. You can design your API first, or you can go ahead and code it up first. So next question. So how many people, when they did their APIs, just coded it up first? Okay. So I'm surprised I didn't see more hands than that. Or maybe you're not fessing up. Okay. So is it safe to assume that the others designed first? Okay, we'll see. All right. So let's talk about code first. So code first is basically somebody comes to me and says, hey, I need an API. Okay, so get out my favorite editor. Mine happens to be, working in Java, so I'll use IntelliJ or Eclipse. Jump in there, start coding up my REST service, and then put some annotations on it if I'm smart, right? And then I'll run Swagger over that, and then I'll get a little Swagger doc, and my API's done. I'm good. All right, code first. Now, my customer comes in and says, oh, I need to do this, I need to do this, that, and the other, this field, or I'm missing other information, or I need to tie this in with something else. So now the fun and games start, right? While you're negotiating through that whole process, you're having to fiddle around with your code to do that, right? Okay. So code first, it works. There's a lot of code first APIs out there, but I will say that for the most part, the quality is probably not going to be what it should be, right? Your other alternative is design first. Okay, so think about your API. There's nothing new there. Everybody says this. I remember when I was in college, and it was like, oh yeah, sit down, think about what you want to do, and then code it up, right? But there's actually more to that sort of design first aspect. They're thinking more in terms of a process as well as the tooling, right, for that. And then there's approaches that you can take to get a good API. So how many people have heard of domain-specific design, right? So Evans. Yeah, Evans is the guy that wrote the book on that. So the whole idea there is that you think about the objects or the artifacts in your business domain, right? So in our case, it might be ad or spot. It might be order. It might be customer. And you design your services and your APIs around those business contexts, okay? So you'll pretty much have an API that says something like /customer /name, right? If I just want to get the name of the customer, /order /submit, or actually that'd be a put request, and so on, okay? And what that lets you do is as you start adding functionality and features, you can start just adding the methods to those APIs and build out your APIs. So this is where versioning comes in. As long as I'm adding features, it's not really going to break anybody, right? And I can start adding additional attributes and so on where I need them. Okay. So the idea behind design first is you'll use a tool. Yes? Okay, that's a good point. Can I hold that for a second? And then I'll come back to that. Okay, so the idea is at least that you'll identify your methods, your attributes, what you want to do, and then you need to obviously have a back and forth with your consumers on what that is. And it's design first is the whole idea behind that is to iterate through that cycle quickly, right? As quickly as possible to get to what you need. And you can tell if you're having to code up everything, it's going to take you longer, okay? The other thing to think about when you're doing design first is very often you can actually generate a substantial amount of your code, right, if you're using the correct tools. So how many people have used Swagger or OpenAPI? Okay, couple. So Swagger, I'll show you an example later, actually has the ability to generate code stubs for you, so you don't actually have to sit there and write your whole REST server. You can literally plug in your business code and back in and then use the code stubs that they've generated, right? So that's nothing new, but they happen to have tooling for that. So that's one of the efficiency gains that you'll get from taking that approach. Whereas if you're writing code first, guess what? You're doing it yourself, okay? All right, yeah, I'm gonna get to it. Okay, so here's why I kind of tabled your question. All right, so there's a bunch of ways that you can implement your APIs, right? So implementation language in the web API context, it's your choice. Use what you want. Follow the standards in your company. All good, right? Consumers don't care. That's the idea. So use yours. Use whatever you want. Abstracting out implementation details, right? So when you're designing your API, you should be surfacing a business interface, right? So if you've got XYZ flag, XYZ code, the blah 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 control blah variable whatever, that's not an API. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about business abstractions. Okay, so an order has a product that's assigned to it. That product code probably isn't an appropriate flag or attribute to have in that order interface, right? Because product code is an attribute of a product.
Can I get on that real quick? Because I think that's something we see a gap a lot in software engineering, is that they're really good technically, but they struggle translating to business outcomes. And I think what Arthur's hitting on is you have to take your technical and translate it to something that's meaningful to the business. And the more you start understanding your business partners, understanding how they say things, not how you say things, will make your APIs more functional, not only for internal use, but external parties, because it translates. No one understands. That's why you keep saying your consumer shouldn't care what's on the back end. It should be duck on water. You just see the duck, they're graceful. There's a lot happening underneath, and you need to translate that for your consumers and make it simple. The simpler the better. Put it in terms they would understand. that's industry-wide sometimes. So when we're talking ads and spots and radio, like the radio industry, there's terminology we use across the industry. Well, I shouldn't come as a developer and go, I'm going to call this not spots, I'm going to call it, radio breaks. I'm just going to give it that name. Well, no one's going to understand that. So I think you've got to translate for everybody in a meaningful way that the business understands. And it's a gap that happens quite a bit. It's something that's overlooked a lot.
So ideal in the ideal world, you should be able to take your API spec, right? Go sit down with your business stakeholder and use that to literally go through and go, yep, okay, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this. And he should not get glazed eyes and start, fainting. Okay. All right. Some languages, so when I'm saying languages here, I'm talking about specification languages, have better support for code generation servers and clients, right? So I'm going to talk about those in a minute. I'll give you show you a couple of examples of what the spec languages look like. And then last but not least, obviously HTTP-based protocols include things like gRPC, WebSockets, as well as REST, right? GraphQL is, that's being really pushed by Facebook and co right now. And I'd love to have a chat, if we have some time, about what I'm seeing in that area. But what you'll find is that they don't have the same kind of support that REST-based APIs do today. Okay, so by far and away, the most predominant way to expose web APIs today is probably via REST. Okay, and to that point, there's a lot of interpretation about REST out there, what that is and isn't. So you're going to find flavors of REST, okay, as you start looking. So if you want to get into REST, building REST APIs, definitely go back and read Mr. Fielding's dissertation. Understand what he's talking about to start with. That's a really good place to start. And then the RFCs on that topic are really good. Okay, so I think, yeah. So 3 different ways that I've seen that seem to have some traction in the industry right now for specifying REST APIs. The first is Open API, also known as Swagger. Okay, so there's a bit of confusion about the naming there. So Swagger's really was the precursor, but SmartBear's brandmarked that. They've basically trademarked that, and so now it's Open API. Okay, and then the second is RAML, which came out of MuleSoft. So MuleSoft has actually joined the Open API consortium now, and you're seeing their influence in Open API 3.0. Okay, and then, but they still have it, RAML's still floating around. And then the third, which is on the next slide, is API Blueprint, which personally I think is actually the most elegant of the 3. Unfortunately, it's not as well established. It was developed by a company called Apiary that got bought out by Oracle. It's in the open source domain. However, Swagger and Open API have by far and away the largest footprint. So if you're doing web APIs, you cannot ignore it. Okay. All right. Let's see if we can pull up some examples of this desktop. All right, so let's look at an Open API example. Real quick. Oops. Okay, so this is an Open API example. So what you're seeing, I'm not going to walk through everything. It's YAML, right? And obvious things, you've got description tags so that you can write your descriptions in. If you're running this in a Swagger editor, it will give you a nice, readable, legible display for the API itself. I've got provisions for adding, contact information and stuff. This piece right here is where it starts to get exciting. Is where we're starting to define our routes, right? Our routes. And then parameters. So if you scroll down a little bit, other things you'll see, you can define your responses, what my service is actually doing, the return types, so the content types that you're returning. In this case, this service only does application JSON. And, oops. The actual data itself that's being returned comes in the component section, right? So in this case, it's track metadata that I'm returning, and then I've got a title, album, artist, some track, and then I've got an error object, okay? So that gets, like I said, if you've ever looked at a Swagger editor, they render that in a nice HTTP form for you. You can then test your API in the Swagger editor. Okay, so that's one way to do it. The RAML version, let's see if that's smart. Oh dear, okay. Yeah, it's just, thank you. Put me out of my misery very quickly, that's good. All right, so RAML, also YAML based, okay. You're capturing similar information. What's my base URI, the media type, application JSON in this case. I've got tags for documentation. You notice that RAML is a little bit more concise than Swagger is, right? It doesn't have tags, for example, for things like, specifically for things like contacts, right? There's a way to define your security in the security schemes, and then I've got my API. All right, so very similar. It returns a 404 and a 200 in this case, and then and my data types, right? So you can see, like I said, so remember what the Open API looked like. That was version 3. Version 2 of Open API looked different. Anybody who's played with it can tell you that. So this is where MuleSoft has actually started working to influence the direction of Open API. And then last but not least, my favorite is API Blueprint. And with API Blueprint, you'll notice this is not YAML anymore. This is actually Markdown, right? Which is, it's very, very simple to read. It follows the same styling patterns as you use for doing GitHub pages and so on. All right. So again, I've got my my URL, and then information that I chose to put in. My track info right there. That's where my API starts, and then the parameters, what I'm responding with, and security. Now that's one of the things that's different between API Blueprint and some of the others, is if you have to actually define all your security stuff yourself, right? But you can actually just include it. And then the actual returns on the data structures are defined like that. The nice thing about API Blueprint, if you're using their editor, is that you can actually just go ahead and put in example responses and then run through those. And then you can actually offer that up to somebody else that you're collaborating with. Unfortunately, I don't have the editors and stuff set up for this stuff. All three of these have sort of WYSIWYG editors that you can use, where you work in the editor on one side, edit your Markdown or edit your YAML. On the other side, they're showing you what the documentation looks like. Okay, so that's that. Let's go back to the slide deck real quick. All right, how are we doing on time? Okay, great. Well, I think I have a feeling I'm going to have some questions about WebSockets and co, right? Okay, yeah, so that's what I wanted to really talk about, if I can find my mouse. Where's it gone? Oh, there we go. There. So, WebSockets, GraphQL, Google RPC, where'd they fit in, right? So let's take GraphQL first. So the idea behind GraphQL is kind of neat, right? It's got a schema to it that you can work with, and that's really cool. And then you basically it gives you the flexibility, and that's the whole argument for GraphQL, I think, is they're saying, well, it's very flexible to use because you get to formulate your queries in your UI or your client, and you just work with the schema. My analogy is I'm working with an SQL database, and I gave you SQL and said, well, just go ahead and figure out how to do your queries. Okay. A long time ago, people realized that it was a bad idea to tie their user interfaces to their database schemas. Right? They put in an abstraction layer to get around that. It seems like we're doing a loop back around now, but it's in the web. Okay, that's kind of my take on it. It's just one take. I'm not Facebook, so, but it's got a lot of traction. Can't ignore it, right? So if you're working on Facebook, you have to deal with this, right? So basically, what you get is you get a REST API that lets you execute queries in a query language against a GraphQL server, and that GraphQL server has a schema that's defined, and the GraphQL server actually is integrated in with your data stores or with your REST services behind the scenes, and that's what a typical architecture will look like in that environment. Okay, there's still request response, so it's fairly analogous. I would say that you could probably do everything with GraphQL that you can do with a standard REST API. It really depends on how you like to work your paradigms, whether you prefer to work with business domain entities or whether you prefer to work with queries, right? Up to you. WebSockets, on the other hand, yes. Sure.
So I spent some time working on a mobile side of technology. So APIs that we are developing in enterprise are sometimes very heavy for example mobile usage. So that is where QL came into place, where you can, instead of getting all those very expensive calls to the backend 2-3 times, you can specify from the one call what exactly you need and get to your over the very limited connection data that exactly you need to present. So that would be my take on where I see the most usage for the technology. Yeah.
So that's where GraphQL fits in. It's not going away, right? But what you're going to find is, remember when we were talking about API management, we were talking about catalogs for service discovery, and we were talking about documentation portals. Well, guess what? In the GraphQL world, you're writing that stuff yourself. I'm not aware right now of any kind of tooling that's available to produce documentation for your GraphQL schema, right, today. There may be some, I just haven't. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I guess this is GraphQL, which the whole thing about GraphQL is it's supposedly self-documented.
Yeah.
It has code completion, and it'll just use the schema. And you may disagree, but they're saying the schema is the documentation.
Right. I've heard that before, right?
Yeah.
So I C++ days. Oh yeah, the code's a schema. Guess what? Yes, exactly. So, yeah, I still think you need to have some stuff on top of that that explains to people how to do certain things. Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's the point with GraphQL. The other thing is that if you look at, for example, Facebook's documentation, they have extensive examples of so on and so on. All that has to be produced, okay, manually. Somebody's running the query saying, okay, this is what you get back, and so on. All right. Still, like I said, though, very viable. Facebook's proved that it works. Okay, WebSockets. WebSockets are different in that it's not, it piggybacks over HTTP, right? However, it's bidirectional, it's full duplex. So you're not just making a request. Basically, you're establishing a connection to a server, and you're holding on to that connection for the life of your application or until you decide to disconnect. And you, the client, you can send information down that pipe, or the server on the other end can send you information. And that's what makes WebSockets so attractive, right? So picture situations, maybe you want to do a stock ticker, or you want to do news tickers, if you hate the banks, right? Then WebSockets lends itself very, very well to that. But it has scalability implications, because you've got to, there's only a limit to a certain number of connections that you can host off any given server. Okay, so just be aware of that when you're looking at WebSockets. WebSockets, you're going to design your API yourself, period. There's no Swagger support for that. You could conceivably go, okay, well, I'll define something and communicate it that way, but there's no direct support for it, right? So you have to figure that stuff out yourself. All right, you're literally going to define your protocol on top of your WebSockets. There are some tools out there for that, for helping you with WebSockets, however. So Socket.io if you're working with Node and JavaScript, or you're just doing the server backend in that tech stack, right? I believe it's Async.io. If you're doing anything with event-driven, you should take a look at Async.io. So they have libraries that will let you, and it basically comes with a way to specify out your protocol, and you have bindings for different protocols. So it will let you do MQTT as well as WebSockets and so on. All right, and then last but not least, Google RPC, which basically has a protobuf, I believe is what they call it. It's very similar to WebSockets in some ways. It's not open standard, right? It relies on Google's code. And again, you'll be doing a lot of documentation and stuff yourself, right? It's just I think the user community is not as large, so that's going to take a little bit more work. And if you're wanting to have people adopt your API, then you've kind of got to think very carefully about that. Yes?
API, you've got to pay, right?
It depends. It depends. So, for example, I mentioned Oxford Dictionary. Why did I use them? Very simply because their API was free, and for me, right? They don't care. They didn't care. But they also had a monetized version of their API out there. Okay. If I'm Shopify, for example, right, where my business is offering you order management and carts and product catalogs and all this stuff, then I'm going to charge you to use my API, right? So it really depends on the business model behind that and what their intent is, which flips right back into how are they monetizing, right? The API. So in a lot of cases, you can actually just go up to the developer site. eBay's like that, so you can just go in and sign up for eBay, get your own client ID and stuff, and start using their APIs for some things, not for everything, but you can browse catalogs and things like that. Yeah. So it really depends on how they want to monetize. Yeah. Any other questions on that? Yeah.
And thanks for coming and giving this talk, but I think this is a very comprehensive look at APIs and how to manage them, because usually when we look at it from the implementation standpoint, like how do we use this, how do we create it, but it's actually also good to look at from a business standpoint of is this API making sense? Is there a purpose for this kind of stuff? So can you talk a bit more on the management of the APIs, where let's say you have created an endpoint, an API given to a client. Let's say a client decides to create their own application that uses the API, but then they create an endpoint to their clients. Do you worry for that type of scenario? Or is there a way to go around that sort of situations. Can you speak?
Sure. So first off, if it were me, right, and I had an API for my small company and my life, whether I have bread on the table tomorrow depends on whether I know who's using this and how much, then I'm going to use some sort of solution that lets me track who's using my API. Now, do I care whether that's indirect use or direct use as long as I get my dollars? The answer is probably not, right? What I want to know is who's directly using my API, right? And therein lies the rub, right? So the way that API management tooling typically works is that a developer will go up and they'll go, hey, I've got this fancy application. I figured out how to play iHeartMedia's music and tie that up to some sandwich shop of the day, right? And so I want to build an app that does that, right? So I'm going to go to iHeartMedia's. Unfortunately, we're not that far along yet, but I'm going to go to that company's API portal, and the first thing I do is I sign up for a client key, right? So that client key is my identifier that identifies me as an institution or as an application. It's not an individual's ID, right? And that all the stuff that I do with that API is tied to that client key. So with typical API management tooling, I can say with this client key, you can access these 5 APIs, but you can't use that one. I can say, well, you know what, you're a gold tier customer, so I'm going to let you do 50,000 requests per hour. All right? You're not paying me, so you get to do 15. Okay? It's all tied to that API key. So when I sign in to get my token for the API, however I've implemented that, whether that's OAuth or proprietary, basically what happens is that you set up, you configure, and this is where the API management tools are really useful. You configure things like that. How much can they use? How often? What time of day? Which APIs? Right? You can configure all that, and based on that, when that customer when I start calling their API, the API management layer is checking all this and then saying yes, yay, nay, rate limit exceeded, and so on. Okay, so to answer your question, if I as a consumer of an API choose to proxy out and let somebody else use it and slap APIs on top, I don't care. Right? I would if it was a bank account, right? But otherwise, I really don't care. Okay. All right. So, any others? Good? Yeah.
There's an API with permission to the user. How do you determine the security on it? If you could share it.
Okay, so I can still, I mentioned eBay, right? So I can still go ahead and let any developer on the planet come up and sign up for a key. So I can track their use by doing that, but I don't have to charge them for it. How do I, I'm sorry? I couldn't hear you, sorry. Oh, well, no. So remember, I'm issuing you keys, right? So when you come sign up as a developer on my portal, I'm issuing you a key. I can revoke that key. And if I revoke that key, you can't use the API, right? Right. You sign up, right? So I'm issuing you a key, and then I'm taking my key back, right? So that's how you manage that. Now, if somebody's careless and they leave their key and their password sitting around, then that's on them, right? Right. Okay. And that's where patterns of usage come in, right? So remember I mentioned that you have a monitoring aspect to API management, right? So if I've got a customer and with a client key X and he's doing, an average 500 requests a day, and then all of a sudden he starts doing 2,500, I might want to actually get in touch with him and go, hey, yeah, dude, what are you doing? Are you still good? Is this? And he'll go, oh yeah, well, you know, I actually rolled out a new version of my software and it's doing fantastic. Great. But he may say, no, I'm still only doing 500 a day, right? And then you'd have to give him a new key. Okay. All good? Well, thank you so much for having us here. It's been really good. If you want to jump up and ask us, have a one-on-one afterwards, that's fine too. I think Eldon and I will be here a couple of minutes. Thank you.